Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to be converting a vanilla JavaScript application over to React. Now the application that we're converting is actually an application from a previous tutorial, and that tutorial is this one right here, which I'm going to link below, which is just a simple calendar application that we made in vanilla JavaScript. Now if you did not follow that tutorial, that's fine. I still recommend you go watch that video and follow through and code it yourself. That way you understand how it works, and I think it'll help you through this tutorial as well, and you can see some of the benefits of React. But that's fine if you don't want to go through and do that tutorial. I'll put a link in the description to the final code from that tutorial, so you can simply clone that repository and then follow this tutorial with that code. Now, really quick, I just want to say, if you haven't already, please go ahead and smash that like button for me and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Now let's go ahead and talk about what we're doing. So let's have a look on the screen here. On this screen right here is the vanilla JavaScript app, and I'm going back and forth throughout the months, and I'm going to create an event here, and it creates the event here. Now I'm going to switch over to the React version. As you can see, there's pretty much no difference at all. There's a slight difference in the padding of these buttons. That's fine, but I can still go through and go through these months and add the events just like I can in the other app. So they're basically the exact same application. The code is quite different though. In one, obviously we're doing vanilla JavaScript, and in the other we're doing React. So I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the mindset differences between writing a React application and a vanilla JavaScript application. So in a vanilla JavaScript application, you're going to end up writing most of the code that you want to implement manually. There's a lot of things that you're going to want to do every single time you write a vanilla JavaScript application that looks similar to what we're dealing with here. And you have to write every single bit of functionality manually, including creating event listeners, creating DOM elements, and then giving them classes, and then putting them into the DOM, etc. Just like everything you want to do, you have to manually do with JavaScript. While in a React application, it's much different. You see, in a React application, you have all of these tools at your disposal, and then you simply choose which of these things you want to react to. So with, for example, event listeners, it already exists on the element. If you're using JSX, you can simply say, okay, on click, do this, or on mouse over, do this. You don't have to add that event listener. It kind of, in a way, already exists on the element, and you simply just have to react to it. You have to hook into it and react to it. And the same thing goes with data changes as well. In React, you can simply react to all of the data changes. You can say, okay, when this value changes, I want to do this. So there's a lot of reactivity, hence the name React in React. So with vanilla JavaScript, it's very declarative. You have to say, okay, I want to do this, and this is how I'm doing it. In React, it's like, okay, I want to do this, so do this when this happens. That's kind of the mindset shift that you have to have when converting something over from vanilla JavaScript over to React. And of course, there's plenty of other differences between the two, but I think that's one of the hardest things to get over, is just that concept in your head of switching from, okay, I want to do this way versus, okay, I want to do this, so let's do this when this happens. I hope that makes sense. You'll see it in practice in just a moment. So to keep things simple, I'm just going to go to the GitHub repository here for the vanilla JavaScript calendar app for the previous tutorial. And I know that a lot of people following this tutorial might not have went through that video, so you can simply go to the repository and you can see all of the code for it. And what we're going to be doing is basically copying a lot of the code out of here into our new project and then reactifying it. Now, the major difference though is that in the original video, I had you copy the style.css file because I didn't want to worry about, having CSS as part of the tutorial. You could just copy the CSS, paste it into your CSS file and call it a day. And we focused on the HTML and JavaScript. We're going to do the same thing here, except there was a few small changes that I decided to make in the CSS file. So what you're going to have to do is you're actually going to have to go to the repository for this React version of the app, which is in the description below, and copy that CSS file. And don't worry, you'll see me do that in just a moment. So to kick things off, what we need to do is open an instance of your code editor, whatever your preferred code editor might be. And I'm going to go ahead and open up an empty folder in my code editor right now. So I have just opened up a completely empty folder that I named React Calendar in my VS Code. Now, if you're not using VS Code, if you're using something that doesn't have a built-in terminal, you'll probably want to open this up in your terminal as well, because we're going to have to run a couple commands in order to get this project initialized. So what I'm going to do is open this up inside of my terminal here built into VS Code, which happens to be PowerShell right now. So in order to get things running, I need to do npm init to initialize an empty npm project. It's going to ask me a couple questions like the package name, which I'm just going to keep default. I'll keep the version default. Description, I'm going to say converting a vanilla JS app to React. For the entry point, it says index.js. That's fine for now. Test command, that's fine. Empty keywords, empty author. I'm going to put my name. For the license, I'm going to put MIT, and then it's going to ask me if it's okay. I'll say yes. And what that did was it created a package.json file. So in this package.json file, we have this scripts section, and we're going to add a script shortly. We're going to add the script that starts the application. I realized I just misspelled vanilla, so I'm going to add an L there really quick. So eventually we're going to add a start script, but what are we going to use to boot this application? How are we going to get this React application to run? What is going to serve this application for us on our local machine in order for us to be able to develop? And the answer is we're going to be using Snowpack for this, because I believe that's one of the easiest ways we can do it, and it's also extremely fast. So I'm going to run npm install Snowpack. It finished installing, and now I can look in my package.json file and see that Snowpack is officially a dependency on the project. And now I can go in here into my scripts object and add a start script, and the value for that start script is going to be Snowpack dev. Cool. So now we have the ability to sort of bootstrap this application, but we don't really have an application. We only have a package.json file, package lock.json file, and our node modules folder. So we actually need to put some stuff in here. And at the very root of this, I want to create a index.html file, and I also want to create a style.css file. So let's go ahead and knock out getting our style.css file completed, because again, I don't want to focus on styles in this tutorial. We'll do some CSS tutorials in the future, but for now, I just want to focus on React. I think they're two separate concepts. So go ahead and go to the repository in the description below that says React repository, complete code, something along those lines. Go there and copy the style.css file and paste it into here. Now I've got the code already, so I'm going to do that on my end. But just remember, this is the React version of the CSS from the React repository. Okay, so that should be all you need from that side. Go ahead and head over to the vanilla calendar repository and go into the index.html file. Now the index.html file for the vanilla JavaScript file is the actual HTML for the application. And then inside of the script.js, we write a bunch of code that kind of dynamically generates a bunch of stuff that we inject into the HTML. We're not going to do that with React. With React, it's a bit different. So what I'm going to do is actually go back into my index.html file for our project. I'm going to get my boilerplate code generated here, and I'm going to change the title here to be the same as what is inside of the index.html file for the original tutorial. So I'm just going to copy that. And I'm also going to copy the line for the style.css here. So I'm copying the link file, the link tag here, so that my style.css file that we just pasted and populated here is now referenced in the index.html file. And when I save it, you would expect there to be nothing in the document. And that's true. There would be nothing in the document. So we need to somehow put some stuff in the document, right? Well, in a React application, we're able to take the entire application, compile it down, and inject it into an index.html file, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to create a div with an ID of root. This is where we're going to end up housing our entire React application. But we need to actually reference a JavaScript file which does that compiling process and injecting process, which React handles all for us. But we still have to reference that file here because this index.html file is the entry point for the app. It's what actually gets served to the browser. So it has to somehow say, okay, go grab this JavaScript file. And then when it gets this JavaScript file, that's when it's going to do all that React magic stuff. So we actually have to have a JavaScript file that does all that. So let's go ahead and create a source folder. I'm just going to call it src for source. And inside of here, I'm going to create an index.jsx file. I'm calling it JSX because we're using JSX in this app, which is just a templating syntax. In order to bootstrap this entire application, we're going to use this code right here. Now we're importing React and we're importing React DOM. We have not installed those yet, so keep that in mind. This won't work yet, but we're importing both of those. And then we're importing a app component, which we also have yet to create. Now we're going to create it in just a moment, but let's hypothetically say it already exists so that I can explain this line right now. So what this line right here is doing is it's saying we're going to take that ID of root div right here in our index.html file, and we're going to inject our app component into that. And that is how we're bootstrapping the React application. So we have to reference this JavaScript file inside of our index.html file. So to do that, we're going to create a script tag here at the very end of the body. And we need to set the source equal to src/index.jsx, except we need to get rid of the x. It needs to be .js because that JSX file is actually going to get compiled into a JavaScript file in the end. So Snowpack is going to take that JSX file, convert it to regular JavaScript, and then it's going to be a JS file in the end. So we can't use JSX because when it's compiled, it'll be a JS file. So make sure that you use JS instead of JSX. And the only other change we need to do here is set the type here to type equals module. So once I save this, this is going to end up importing this JSX file, which is going to be bootstrapping the entire React application. But we need to install React and React DOM. So I'm going to quickly do that. Inside of my terminal, I'm going to run npm install --save react space react-dom. So I'm going to let that install really quick. And now that that's installed, the only other thing left to do to get this React application bootstrapped and at least running is to create my app component, because we're importing the app component here and that doesn't exist currently. So I'm going to create a folder called app. And then inside of this folder, I'm going to create a app.jsx file. And I'm going to go ahead and create my app component right here. So I'm just importing React and I'm exporting a function called app that just returns some JSX. And for now, we're going to just have it say hello from the app component. I'll save it. And I'll save this, and let's see if we can get this application to run. Oh, the other thing that I'm seeing is that I'm importing this from /app, and this is the folder. So in order to import it from the folder instead of the file itself like this, I think it's cleaner to import it like this. I need to go inside of my app folder and create a new file called index.js and just simply export my app component. So I'm exporting everything from app. I'll save that, and now I can easily just import it like this, which I think is cleaner. So now let's see if we can run this app. Inside of my terminal, if you remember, we created that command npm start, which runs snowpack dev. I'm going to run npm run start, or you can just say npm start for short. Now you can see that it says hello from the app component inside of my browser. So I'm zooming in a little bit. You should be able to see that. So we know that the React application is bootstrapped correctly. We know that we got the app working. We can start working on the actual calendar now. So the first thing I want to do is start creating components. I want to try to think about what the calendar app is and try to break down certain pieces of functionality into separate components. And once I create those components, then I can use this app component here as a higher order component that uses those smaller components. And don't worry, you'll understand that in a moment. But for now, let's just try to think about the different pieces of the app and how we can break them down into smaller pieces. So the first thing that I'm thinking is if I go to the calendar, we can see that there are several pieces to this application. There's the calendar itself, which consists of squares. Each of these squares is a day. So I could say, okay, there's a day component. This day component here looks like this. It has its own styles. It contains the event. It has a click listener because I can click on it and it shows the event, and it displays events, etc. So there's the day component. Then I see this header here, and this header has its own functionality as well because it has the back and the next buttons to go through the different calendar months. And it also displays the current month. So there's, I guess we could call that the calendar header component. But then if you notice, when I click on this day, there is a modal, and this modal could be its own component, but there's actually two modals. There's the delete event modal, and then there's the new event modal. So that's two more components. So we have a total of 4 so far. And I think that's pretty much all the components we're going to need for this app. We don't need to break it down any further than that. So let's create those in our app right now. So we have the app component. It has its own folder. And inside of here, we have the component itself along with an index file that exports it. And we're going to follow that same pattern for each of the other components. So I'm going to create folders for each one. And I'm going to start with the day component. And in here, we're going to create a day.jsx file and an index.js file, which simply exports the component from within. Then inside of the actual day component, I'm going to import React from React, and then I'm going to export a function called day, which just returns some JSX. And in here, I'm just going to say hello from the day component. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for all 4 of the components. All right. So I have created 4 new components: calendar header, day, delete event modal, new event modal. They all have index.js files along with component files. So now inside of my app.jsx file, this is where I'm going to start writing the logic in order to get the dates set up in order for us to start using these lower level components. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the original application's code in the JavaScript file. So the script.js for the vanilla calendar. And if you remember, when we went through this, we created some state here, and we were just basically saying state was global variables with assigned using let that we could change throughout the application. And then we also had a bunch of constants, but we're going to do things obviously different using React, because React actually has a better way of handling state. We're going to use function components with hooks. So we're going to be using use state in order to handle state within our components. So we have three things here that I'm noticing. We have nav, which is basically the index for us to know which month we're on. We have clicked, which is the day that we clicked, and then events, which is an array of event objects. So we need to create all three of those inside of our component. And I think the best place for that is obviously going to be our higher order component, which we can then pass down to our lower order components as needed. But in order to use state, I have to put a comma up here after React in my import statement and say use state just like this. And we have to destructure it like that. And now we have access to the use state hook. So I'm going to say const, and then I'm going to create an array, because using use state as a function returns an array with two items in it. The first item is the state itself, and the second item is a function to update that state. And you'll see how we use that throughout the app. So the first one was nav, and then we have the set nav function. And we want to initialize this as 0, because 0 is going to be our middle point, which basically says the current month. 1 would be the next month, -1 would be the previous month, and so on. So nav is going to be whichever month we're on, which is 0 right now. And then set nav is a function that we can use throughout this component to update that nav. The second piece of state we want to add is clicked. So const, and we're going to do the same thing here. Clicked and set clicked is equal to use state. And we're not going to initialize this value. We're going to leave it as undefined, because that's actually, I believe, how we do it in the original as well. We leave it as null, which is fine. We can leave it as undefined here, because really what we're trying to do is just have it as a falsy value. And the third piece of state that was in there was events. Now let's look at the code here for events. When we initialized it, we were checking whether or not there was an events item in local storage. And if there was, we simply JSON.parse that out. Otherwise, we set events to be an empty array. This would only happen if it was like the first time we used the application, or if we didn't have any events at all. So we're going to use the exact same logic. I'm going to actually copy this entire line except for the semicolon at the end and pass it in here, because that's how we're going to be initializing our events variable. But I'm going to put this on new lines because it's a little bit big and it's hard to see. So it looks like this. In fact, I could actually break it down even further like that. I think that looks good. So instead of creating day elements and then injecting them into the DOM, what we're going to do is create an array of day objects. So we're going to think about each one of these squares as being an object, and all of these squares are going to make up an array of day objects. And what we're going to do is inside of our JSX template, we're going to loop through those day objects and then render each one on the screen. So I'm going to start by creating a days array in state. So days and set days is equal to use state, which I will initialize as an empty array. The second piece of state that we're going to add is actually this value right here. So instead of just simply generating this on the fly, we're actually going to have this value in state. So we will call that value, I'll come in here, we will call this date display and set date display. Equal to use state, and we'll initialize it as an empty string. And that should do it for our state for now. But one thing that I want to add is a helper function that we're going to have here at the top of the component that we'll probably use in several places throughout the app. So since it's reusable logic, I just want to create it now. And I'm going to call this function event for date. And I'm going to set it equal to a function that accepts a date and then returns events.find. And for each event, we want to find the one where e.date is equal to the date that we pass in. So we want to make sure that we go through the events and find a event where e.date is equal to the date that we're passing in here. And this logic is going to be used throughout the app. So that's why I'm adding it. Okay, now if you remember, I was talking about like thinking about what we want to react to. Instead of thinking about, okay, I want to do this and this is how we're going to do it, and I have to define every step along the way. With React, I want to think of what do I want to react to? And I'm looking at this events variable here that we're setting in state, and I'm thinking that is going to change throughout the application. And we're having to manage state within local storage as well. Now, local storage is our local database, which basically allows us to store values in our web browser. It can be thought of as like a key value database. And we want to keep that in sync with whatever events is at any given time. So if events changes, if that value changes in state, we want to make sure we update the value in local storage as well. So in order to do that, I'm going to use effect, but I need to import that. Now, if you're not familiar with how use effect works, I do have a video that I'm linking below called like React hooks in 6 minutes or something like that, where I do explain how all of this stuff works if you're not familiar with use effect or React hooks in general. But the idea is that whenever events changes, we want to run a function that updates local storage. So we can use effect for that. Now, the first argument to use effect is the function that we want to run, and the second argument is an array of values. And each value that we put into there is a value we're going to watch. And whenever that value changes or any of those values change, we're going to run the function that we pass in right here. So the value we want to look for changing is events. And each time this value changes, we simply want to update local storage with the new value. So we can say local storage.set item. The item name is events, and the value is a stringified version of events. So every single time events changes here in state, our array of event objects, we are setting events in local storage. So I just wanted to knock that out really quick before we start working on the template a little bit. Now let's have a look at our index.html inside of the original vanilla JavaScript calendar. You can see that we have this div, which is a container that pretty much contains the entire application except for our modals. And inside of this container here, we have a header, which contains the month display and the next and back buttons. And we also have this weekdays container here, which never changes. So actually, we'll probably just be copying this directly. And then we have this div with an ID of calendar, which is what we ended up injecting all of our days inside of. So we're pretty much going to use the exact same layout inside of our app. So I'm going to start by copying this entire container div. I'll leave out the modals for now because those are going to be their own components completely. And I'm going to paste them inside of my return here. Now, if you remember, we have a calendar header component. So I can pretty much remove this for now because we're going to put that into its own component, and I'm going to cut it and go inside of my calendar header component and paste that into the return right here. So we're going to come back here and change this code a little bit and add the functionality, but I just want to get the HTML inside of there. And then in here, I need to import that. So I'm importing calendar header here, and then I'm putting it where that HTML was just a moment ago. So now that calendar header HTML that we just pasted in here will now render here along with any functionality we put inside of this component. Now this really does not need to be its own component. This will never change. This is very simple, so we can just leave this the way it is. Now inside of this div is where we're going to be looping through our days array that we have right here, which we have not yet set, but we have this array in state that we're going to loop through in order to render our day components. So in React, what we can do is use curly braces to put some JavaScript inside of our template. And the JavaScript I want to run is actually a map. So I want to use the map function of the array object. So the array that we want to work with is days. Days is our array of days objects. And I want to say days.map, and I want to map every single day to a day component. So I'm going to pull out the day, which I'll just call D, and index, because each of these is going to need its own unique key. And I'm going to use the day component, but I have to import it. So I'm importing day, and I'm rendering a day for every single day in that array. Now, right now, day in our code base is empty, but we'll get to that, and it's going to accept some props. Obviously, one of the props that it needs to accept is the day itself, which we have here in our loop called D. So we're going to end up having a day prop that will pass in to our day component. We need to pass in a key, which we'll set to the index, which is right here, because every time we map through and render a bunch of components of the same type, we need to have a unique key for each one. And the only other thing that we need to do for these day objects, if you remember, these day objects are these squares here on the screen, is an on-click listener. So every time I click on a day, we end up showing a modal. But the way that we really want to handle that is in the original code, we have this. If I go to the script.js file, we have this clicked value, and we end up setting clicked. So if I search for clicked equals in my code here, you can see that whenever we call open modal, we're setting clicked equal to the date. So clicked is actually the date. So when we click on a day, we want to set clicked. So I'm just hooking into the on-click event, which is already exists on any element we pass in Reactjs. And I want to run a function whenever we click on a day. And I want to check something. And if whatever I put into this if statement is true, I want to run the following code, which is simply set clicked. And if you remember, we have that as state. I want to set clicked equal to day.date, because our day object is going to have a date and a value and some other things, which you'll see shortly. But we want to set clicked equal to the date of the day that we click on. But what is it we want to check first before we click on a day? Well, if you remember on the original video, we had this concept of padding days. Some of these day objects are actually going to be padding days, and the way that we're going to know that they're padding days is if the value is equal to the word padding. So if day.value does not equal padding, then we want to go ahead and set clicked equal to the date that we clicked on. If it does equal padding, we don't want to do anything because the padding days are just there for padding. So if you're not familiar with what padding days are and all that, you'll see later on. But again, we went over all of this in the original tutorial. So we're rendering a day for every day object in the array, but we don't have anything in this array. It's an empty array. We initialized it as an empty array. Right now, we have to set up some sort of functionality which creates that array of day objects. So let's just see what's in the window right now, because I'm kind of curious. If we look here on our local host where we're running the application, you can see that we have the calendar header. We don't have the current month because we're not setting the date string in state yet, but we do have the back and next button, which do absolutely nothing yet. And since we hard coded Sunday through Saturday and our CSS is already taken care of for us, you can see that the header here with the Sunday through Saturday dates are displaying as expected. I think that it's time to go ahead and start looking into how we can populate that day array with our day objects. And in order to do that, we have to initialize some date stuff. And if we go to the original app, if you remember at the very bottom, what we're doing when we initialize this application is we're calling it init buttons, which we do not have to worry about in this app because init buttons was simply just setting event listeners for all the buttons. React kind of handles that for us, so we don't have to worry about that at all. But we are also calling this load function. And if I scroll up to that function, you can see that the load function is what's creating the date object. It's what's determining which month we're on, and it's doing all of the date stuff. So we have to bring this logic over to our React application, but in a way that makes sense for React. Because if you notice, there's a bunch of like document.get element by ID. There's creating elements. You can see we're creating a div. We don't have to do any of that stuff in React because of the way that React works. So we're going to take this logic and bring it over incrementally and put it inside of a effect in our component that runs when the component mounts or when certain values change. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So the first part of this logic is that we're creating an empty date object. I'm going to bring this window over to the left and my code over to the right. Actually, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to bring the code to the left and have this on the right. And I want to start bringing this logic over one by one. So in order to run the functionality, I'm going to run this inside of a effect. Now, if you remember, we call load when certain things happen throughout the application. And this is where that mindset shift really starts to hit. Because you see, we call load manually throughout this app. If I were to go inside of here and check for whenever I call this, you can see that we call load every time we close the modal, which in effect is really just when events changes, because inside of the modal, what we're doing is changing events. We're either deleting an event or we're saving an event. So we're calling load in this whenever we update events. And then we also call it whenever we change nav. Like in this case right here, we're calling load when nav increments, and then we're calling load when nav decrements. And we also call it on init. And use effect is perfect for this because automatically it's going to call whatever we pass in here on init. But we can also add in items into this dependency array where we can call that function when certain values changed. And if you remember, we are calling load whenever nav changes or whenever events changes. So I can actually come into here and put events and nav into my dependency array. And now this will run both on mount and also when events changes and when nav changes. So events is the state we have here and nav is the state we have here. And whenever those change, we're going to run this functionality. So just that's that mindset shift that I was talking about. So let's start by creating a date object just like we have here. So I'm copying that over and I'm going to also copy this over. This is what was setting the correct month depending on what nav is, because remember, each time you increment nav up, we're incrementing up to the next month. And same with the other way as well. So below that, I'm gonna paste this stuff because we're using that throughout this function. Looks like we'll probably need these as well. So I'm going to paste these. Then we have the padding days and the date string. So I'll copy these over as well. As you can see, I'm just checking to make sure that it makes sense to bring certain things over, and then I'm copying and pasting over to the left. So far I've pretty much pasted this entire piece right here. And one thing that I'm noticing is that this padding days variable is using a weekdays variable that we do not have in this component yet, but it is over here. It's set as a global constant. Well, it doesn't really have to be a global constant in our React app because it's only being used inside of this effect. So I'm going to paste it here at the very top. I'm setting the weekdays array here at the top of the effect that we're working within right now. I'm just going to close that gap. So now we have all of this. If we look back over here, the next line of code is saying document.getElementById month display, and we're setting the inner text equal to this value right here. Now, if you remember, in React, we don't do that. We don't reach into the DOM and set inner text. We just simply don't do that. Instead, we update values, and then in our template, we react to those value changes. And we happen to have some state here that we set earlier, or we initialized earlier, called date display. So what we want to do is actually set date display equal to the same value that we're setting here. And then inside of our calendar header component, we just want to set the display value equal to date display. So let's start by just copying this string interpolation line right here. And let's set that value. Let's just set it above padding days here. So in order to set the value, and I'm just going to make this a little bigger. In order to set the value, we'll use set date display. And we're going to pass in that same line of code that we copied from over here. It's going to just simply set that in state. We don't have to worry about that anymore right now. We can just simply know that we have that value in state, and it's updated every time events or nav changes along with when the component mounts. Then comes the for loop here. This for loop is what loops through, as you can see, the correct number of times that we have for both the padding days and the days in the month. It loops through that number of times, and then it creates a div and it creates a day square. It adds the correct classes and it sets the values and all that good stuff. We're not going to do it that way. Instead, we're going to do the same loop, but instead of doing all this stuff, we're going to build that days array that I was talking about earlier that we have right here. We need to build this days array. So to do that, we'll create pretty much the exact same for loop. Let I equals 1. We want to keep looping while I is less than or equal to padding days plus days in month. And for each loop, we want to increment I by 1. And we have all of these values because we copied them over. Now inside of this for loop, we want to start by creating our day string, just like we are here in our code on the right. So I'm copying over this line. Maybe zoom in a little bit just to make sure you can see it. Got a lot on the screen, I know. So I'm copying this line over. That's the first thing we want to do inside of our for loop. Then if you remember, we have this logic here that checks whether or not we're on a padding day or an actual day. We're going to keep that same logic. So I'm going to create that same if else block, and with pretty much the exact same logic. So I'm copying over. If I is greater than padding days, then we know we're not on a padding day, we're on an actual day. Otherwise, we're on a padding day. So what do we want to do if we're not on a padding day? Well, on this side, what we were doing was we were setting the inner text for the day square to the current day that we were on in the iteration. And then we were checking whether or not we were on the current day. And we were also checking to see if there was an event for the day. If there was an event for the day, we were creating a event div and then adding it to the day square and all that good stuff. But instead of doing all that, I just want to build that array. So outside of this for loop, I'm going to create a little bit of a dummy array. We'll just call it const days array is equal to an empty array, and we're going to simply say days are dot push, and we want to push a day object to this days array. And this days object needs to contain 4 properties: value, and value is going to be that value that we were setting over here as the inner text. So I minus padding days. Then we want to set an event. So if there is an event, we want to make sure that there is an event value here. Now, of course, not all days are going to have events. If we look at the app here, for example, on this calendar, the only day that has an event in this month is the 1st of January. So the day object for January 1st would contain an event, but the rest would not. And the way that we were finding whether or not we had an event was searching through the events array and trying to see if we found one equal to the day string. Well, if you remember, we have this helper function that we created towards the beginning of this video-ish called event for date, and we're going to use that here. So we're going to set event equal to event for date, and we'll pass in the day string. The day string is that value that we set here at the top of the loop. Now this could either be undefined or it could be actually an event. So event here can either be undefined or an event itself. And for most days, it's probably going to be undefined. The third property that we want to set is whether or not it is the current day. So is current day is either going to be true or false. And if we look at the calendar app that is complete, you could say that I'm making this tutorial, I'm recording this tutorial on the 28th of January. So for me, the current day would only be true if the date was the 28th. Now in the original application, what we were doing to check for that logic is right here. We had this if statement and we were saying if I minus padding days is equal to day and also nav is equal to 0, then we know it's the current day. And the reason why we're checking for nav is equal to 0 is because we want to make sure that we're on the current month. And if the nav is not equal to 0, then we're not on the current month. So this logic right here is saying if the current iteration value minus the padding days is equal to the day, and the day being the day we're getting from our date object, then we know that the current iteration we're on is in fact the current day. So I can take that exact same logic, this if statement, turn it into a ternary operator instead of an if statement, and then set the value here. So I'll simply copy the logic inside of my if statement and paste it here, use the question mark for my ternary operator to say if this is true, then I'm going to pass in true. Otherwise, I'm going to say that it is not the current day and we can set it to false. However, we don't really have to do it this way because this in itself is going to resolve to either true or false. If it's true, then we're returning true. If it's false, then we're returning false. So I can just get rid of this completely and just have this piece by itself because we know this is either going to return true or false. So is current day is going to be whatever this resolves to. And then finally, we're going to have the actual date value as part of our day object. Now the date value is going to literally be the day string. So we can just pass in day string here. So now we're pushing, what we've done was we've pushed a new day object to our days array with these values here. Now, if for example, it is not, we are on a padding day, we want to do something a little different, but we still want to push to our days array. So I'm going to paste in the exact code that I just wrote. For the value on a padding day, it's always going to be padding. Because if you remember, if we scroll down, we're checking to see whether or not the value is padding here or not. And if it is, then we're setting some clicked. And inside of our day component, when we get to it shortly, we're going to be checking for that value as well. The event will always be null because padding days should not have events. Current day will always be false. And for the date, we can just put an empty string. And then after our for loop is complete, all we want to do is set days in state equal to our days array. So very quick recap. We're initializing an empty array called days array. We're doing our for loop. We're setting our days array values. We're pushing day objects to this array. Once the loop is over, we're setting that days array in state as our days state. Okay, let's take a quick breather. So as you can see, we are taking pretty much the exact same functionality from our original app here. We're copying and pasting the vast majority of it, but we're just doing it in a different way. So React and frameworks and libraries like React, etc., they don't really make the task of writing code easier. And I got this idea from Svelte, by the way. They don't really make the task of writing code easier. What they do is they change the way that you're thinking about writing code. And you'll start to see that as you begin writing bigger applications that do more and more stuff, the vanilla JavaScript side of it starts to become more and more difficult to manage. And you can probably see it right here. In fact, this app is probably a good threshold to say, okay, this is right at the edge of where we would want to convert a vanilla JavaScript app over to some sort of framework. Now you can create your own framework. You can start developing a pattern for your vanilla JavaScript app and kind of create a framework yourself, but there's just so many good options out there already, such as React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, etc., that you might as well choose one that's already backed by so many developers. And React is an amazing choice for that. But you'll start to see that even just simply the act of reading the code is a lot easier in React if it's structured correctly. If we come over to this vanilla JavaScript app over here and tried to read it and you had never seen it before, it would be it would be somewhat hard to figure out the intricate details of what's going on. Maybe not, but if it was a bigger application, it certainly would. On the React side, it's easier because you already know where to look. You know, hey, we're going to have components, we're going to have hooks, we're going to do things this particular way. So it's easier to just figure out what's going on. All right, let's get back to it. Let's start by getting our day component up and running. If I were to save this and let's have a look over here on our screen, you can see, I'm going to make this big, that we have, instead of day squares, we have a bunch of hello from the day components, and we have one for every single day of the month plus our padding days. That's no good. We want to go into our day component and actually, write the correct code. So let's do that. So over here in my my day component, I want to accept the props that we're passing in here. Now the key, that's just something that's handled by React. That's required by React whenever we're mapping an array to a bunch of components. So don't worry about that. Instead, let's focus on our day and our onClick function. Now let's go in here. We have two props, and the way that we can take these props and accept them is by destructuring the props object. So we can say we want the day and the onClick, and I want to create a div for every day that exists. Let's go to our code here. Let's see what that day squared looked like that we were creating throughout the app. So in our load function in the original application, we were creating this day square. And in each iteration of the loop, we created a new div. We added a class called day. So keep that in mind. Actually, we can go ahead and add that now. We already are creating a div here, so that's the equivalent of creating the div. Second part is we need to give it a class of day, and in React, we use class name instead of class. Let's look back at it. What else are we doing to this day square? Well, we were setting the inner text equal to I minus padding days. Now that I minus padding days is actually the value on the day object. If you remember, we had that array of day objects. The day object dot value is this value here. So instead of setting manually like day square dot inner text, we can interpolate inside of our component like this. So I can use my JavaScript curly braces here and say day.value. However, we only want to show the value if the day.value is not padding. So the best way to do that is to check whether or not it is equal to padding. Like this, say day.value is equal to padding, and then use a ternary operator to set that to an empty string. Otherwise, we will set it equal to day.value. Now, if you remember, that day object also had an event, and we want to render an event inside of this day square. If we look at the original code, if there was an event, we created a div, we gave it a class of event, we set the inner text of that event equal to the title for the event, and then we added it to the day square. So we'll do pretty much the same thing here. We'll check whether or not there is an event. And if there is an event, we'll render out a div with a class of event. And the inner text for that was day.event.title. Simple enough, right? Well, let's have a look at the screen and see what that's rendering. So on my end, I actually have an event here. That's because prior to this, I already created events, so it's still stuck in my local storage. I'm gonna just clear that out really quick. So when I refresh, this is what you should see here. I'll zoom out just a little bit so it fits. You should see this same thing. Now, what I'm not liking is that each of the padding days is being treated like a day. In other words, you can see that there's a box shadow on the padding days, and there's also a hover effect and probably a click function too if we were to add it, and I don't like that. And the reason why is because we're giving every single div, every single day square div, a class of day. And we really don't want to give the padding days a class of day. So at the top here, I'm going to create a variable called class name, and I'm going to set it equal to a string using these backticks where we're going to interpolate some stuff. And actually every single one of these does get the class of day. So we'll say each of these gets a class of day. However, some of them will have a class of padding. And if there's a class of padding, we hide those day styles. So what I'm going to do is put in my $ in curly braces and check whether or not day.value is equal to padding. So if day.value is equal to padding, we want to give it the padding class. Otherwise, we'll just leave an empty space here. And we should do the exact same thing with current day. Because if you remember in the original application, we would highlight the current day, and we would do that by giving it an ID or a class of current day. In the original application, we gave it an ID. In this one, we're going to use a class, which is why you need to have those updated styles in the CSS file. So we'll add a space here, add a new $ in curly brace, and we'll check for day.isCurrentDay, which we're setting in the app component. And if day.isCurrentDay is true, we'll give it a class of current day. Otherwise, we'll leave an empty string there. And instead of setting class name to day here, just like this, hard-coded, we'll put in our curly braces and pass in class name instead. Save, go back, and now you can see that we both have the current day, and we also have no design for the padding days, which is what we would want. Cool, this is starting to look pretty close to the original application. We're actually gonna need to add our onClick function though, because right now we're not actually doing anything on click. However, we are passing in our on click here. So for our day div, what we can do is set the on click equal to on click. If you remember, when we're passing this in the app component here, this right here in our app component is where we're checking to make sure that we want to call the on click function, because we don't want to call the on click function for padding days. Instead, we only want to make sure that we call the on click function if day.value does not equal padding. So just remember that that's where we're doing that check. So we can just easily pass in on click here without doing any sort of if else checks. So I'll save there, and I will save here, and let's go ahead and see about adding adding events, because now we have the days listed out, but we don't have the ability to add new events yet. So let's go ahead and work on our modal for create event. So hop into your new event modal, hop over to the code, and we'll just copy that code for the new event modal. If I go back out of here, go to the index.html file, scroll down, you can see we have the new event modal. However, notice that we also need to have the modal backdrop, because the modal backdrop is what is that black opaque screen in the background that kind of hides the rest of the app while you're showing the modal. We need to have that inside of this component as well. So I'm going to actually keep this React fragment here, and inside of there, paste in the code I just copied for the event modal, but then I'm gonna go back and actually copy this modal backdrop and paste it below the modal itself. And we're gonna have to do the same thing in our delete event modal. So we'll do this one afterwards. Okay, so we have the HTML set up for our new event modal, but we are not implementing it in our app component, and we don't have any sort of actual functionality over here for our modal. So let's go ahead and start adding that. We need to have two props that get passed into here. We need to have both on save and on close. Then we need to have a couple of pieces of state in here as well, because there is the title, and the title is what you're going to be entering into the text input that's inside of the modal. And we also need to have error state, just in case you try to submit the input without a value inside of it. So let's create both pieces of state, but before that, we need to actually import use state from React. So import that, and then we'll create two pieces of state. We'll do title, which will initialize as an empty string, and we'll have error, which will just be a Boolean. We'll initialize that to false. In our input, whenever that value changes, we want to update title. So on change, we get that change event, and we want to set the title equal to e.target.value. Then we also want to make sure we set the value itself equal to title. So I'm gonna bring this all to separate lines so that it's easier to read. And the only other thing we want to add on this input is potentially an error. And we can just go into our class name here, set our curly braces, and say if there's an error, then we should give it the class name of error. Otherwise, we'll just leave it as an empty string. So that's good for our input. Let's go ahead and look at our save button. Well, for the save button, let's add an onClick function. And I'm actually gonna bring everything to a separate line here as well. And inside of our onClick function, we want to check whether or not the title exists, because if they haven't typed in a title, we wanna set an error and all that good stuff, which I'll do right now. So in our else block, we want to set the error to true. Otherwise, if we do have the title here in our if block, we want to say set error false. And then we want to go ahead and say on save, which is that prop that we're getting here. And we want to call it with our title. Now for the cancel button, it'll be a little bit different. We'll add an on click. And for this, we'll just simply pass in on close. So that pretty much does it for this component. Now we need to actually implement the component in our app component. So let's import it and scroll on down to where we want to put this modal. We actually want to make sure that we put it outside of the container div. So in order to put something outside of the container div inside of our return, we have to make sure that we have these fragments here, because we can only return one tag in our return statement. Make sure to add the closing thing. So below our container div, we can actually say new event modal. We need to pass in the on close and the on save props. So for the new event modal, our on save function accepts the title because we're passing in the title. If we go to our new event modal, we're calling on save here with the title. So we need to accept the title here. And we need to do two things whenever we click on save. We need to set clicked to null. That way we can reset the modal. And we also need to set events. So we're updating events. And we need to set it to the events that already exist. So I'm going to use the spread operator for that alongside a new event object with the title. The title we'll just set to title because we already have it here. And we also need to set the date equal to clicked. If you remember, when we click on a day and we show the modal, we actually have clicked. We've set clicked already in state. So we're setting the date equal to clicked whenever we save it. Now, this event modal, if I were to just save it and go to the app, it's just going to be there. And I don't want it to be there by default. I only want to show this if we already have clicked in state. So if clicked is already in state, in other words, if we've clicked on a day, then we want to show the modal. And we also want to make sure that there's not already an event for the day that we clicked on. So I'll cut this, add some curly braces, and we'll put our logic in here to check. So we'll say if clicked. So if clicked is not null or undefined or something like that, and we do not have an event for date, Remember that function? We can pass in clicked here for that. If both of those are true, then we want to go ahead and render the modal. So I'll click save. Let's have a look at what happens here. I'll open up my console just in case we get an error, and I'll click on a date. Let's just click on the 31st. Okay, we definitely got an error. It says reference error day is not defined, and this error is happening at the onClick on line 65 of the app component. The problem is actually pretty simple. You see, I'm calling each day D, not day. So when I'm checking in the if statement here, I need to say d.value and I need to say d.date instead of day.value and day.date. So save that. Now let's give this a try. So I'll click on day 3 and now the modal appears. So let's see what happens if I were to type in something. Click save, and now it looks like it actually worked. So I clicked save, it added testing the app here. Now what happens if I were to click on this? Now nothing happens, and that's because clicked is now, there's a value for clicked in state. However, that second thing that we're checking for, which is whether or not event for date clicked exists, well, it does exist in this case. So that's why nothing's showing up. Now, if I were to click on a day where there is no event, then we get the modal again. Of course, I need to set the onClick function for the cancel button. That doesn't seem to be working. So the point though is if I click on a event where there is an event already, nothing happens because we need to show the delete event modal in that case. We'll do that in a minute, but let's figure out why the cancel button is not working. And that is simple. We have yet to implement the onClose function. And whenever we click on cancel, if we go into the new event modal, you can see that we are calling the onClose function that we're passing in. So what do we want to do when we click the cancel button? It's quite simple. We'll just run a function that sets the clicked value to null. So now when I click cancel, it closes the modal because the modal is only visible if clicked exists in state. On to the delete event modal. So the delete event modal is right here in our code. I'll just copy that over, paste it into my delete event modal here. Remember to include the little fragments here because we need to put our backdrop in there, which I'll just copy over from my new event modal. Copy this little backdrop over. Cool. And we can do very similar stuff inside of this event, inside of this delete event modal here, although I think it might be a little bit more simple in this case than it was for the new event modal. So this is going to take 3 props. It's going to take onDelete. It's going to take event text, and it's going to take onClose. And the reason why we need event text is because we want to show the event in the modal that we clicked on. So luckily, in this case, we don't have any inputs or anything like that. So this is going to be a lot more simple than the other one. Now, inside of our event text paragraph tags here, I can just put a curly brace and actually put our event text inside of here. It's that simple. And then for the buttons, I'm just going to say on the delete button, I'll set an onClick for onDelete. And for the close button, I'll set an onClick for onClose. And that is literally it. We are done with that modal. Now for the logic to show and hide the modal inside of the app component, I'll simply go below this one, add new curly braces. And I'm going to copy this piece right here because it's going to be the exact opposite. So clicked, we want to make sure that clicked exists in state, but instead of checking for an event here and saying we don't want an event, we should only show this if there is an event. Then we need to show the delete event modal, which we have to import. So I'll go up to the top and I'm pretty much just going to copy this line here and change new to delete here as well. And for some reason I have 2 forward slashes, so I need to get rid of that and go back down. Now we can implement it because I've imported it. So we need to pass in the event text. The event text, it's pretty simple. We'll do event for date. So we need to get the event for date, and we want to find the event for whatever we have as the clicked state. And we just want to grab the title from that. Then on close is the exact same logic here. So I'll actually just copy this line and paste it here, just set clicked to null. And then finally on delete, we're gonna run a function whenever we click the delete button that's going to set the events and then set clicked to null. Pretty much the exact same logic here. So I'll paste this in from the onSave function above it, except for instead of setting it like this, I'm going to take the events and I'm gonna filter the events using the filter function on the array object. And for each event, we want to check for the date, and we want to make sure that we allow all of the events where e.date does not equal clicked. Okay, so that in theory should work. Let's check over here. So let's go to this one where I have the event testing the app. I'll click on it. You can see that event is here. The actual event is being displayed as we would expect. And let me just click close, make sure that worked. It did. And now let me try to delete it. So I clicked delete and now it's no longer there. So I'm going to add a new event here. I'll add an event here as well. And I want to delete one and make sure the other one doesn't disappear. Okay, good. All right, so we're just about done here. What we need to do now is set up the functionality to be able to go through the months. So I'm on January. I should see January 2021 here, and I should be able to go back and forth through the months. And of course, that logic is going to live within our calendar header component, which we have yet to implement the functionality for. If you remember, towards the beginning, we are actually setting this date display state, but we're never using it yet. We haven't used it yet. So what we need to do is use it, right? So we have the calendar header component here, but we have yet to implement any props for it. Now we are going to add a couple of props for this component, 3 to be exact. The first one is going to be the date display, which we can actually just set equal literally to date display because we have this in state, and whenever this changes, it will update. But we also want an on next function and an on back function. Now, each time we click on the next button, we just simply want to take the nav and increment it by 1. We want to set nav equal to whatever nav is currently plus 1. So we can say set nav equal to nav plus 1. We'll do pretty much the exact same thing for on back, except instead of plus, we'll say minus. Now, inside of our calendar header component, we actually need to accept these props. So on next, on back, and date display. So inside of our month display here, let's interpolate date display, save, and let's see if we see that now. We do. That works as expected since we're already setting that in state. Now we need to go ahead and add our button on click events, which is probably as simple as you're thinking. We can set the on click here for the back button to be on back, and then we can set the on click for the next button to on next. Click save, and let's go to our calendar and click next. Now it goes to February. Next it goes to March, April, etc. And I'll just set an event, April 4th, which happens to be my birthday. We'll set an event here, make sure I spell that right. And you can see the event shows up. I can refresh the calendar, ends up back on January. If I go back to April, you can see it's still there. I can delete it. It looks like the calendar is fully functional. Now for the cherry on top. What I want to do is go back into my app component and have a look at this huge use effect here. I know that this functionality is necessary and all that good stuff, and it makes sense that it is housed within my app component because that's the higher order component. But what's really bothering me is how much space this is taking up within my file. You see, all of the other components are super clean. They just you can look at it, you can read it. It's super easy to understand. But when I look at this giant use effect, the only way that I can make this easier to understand what's going on is if I were to put comments up here and explain, but I don't really want to have to do that. It's better to have some sort of naming convention. I want to be able to name this effect. And I also don't really want all of these lines of code in this file because it makes it harder to keep this file clean. So what I want to do is break this use effect out into a custom hook. So I'm going to go inside of my source folder here and create a new folder called hooks. Although in reality, I would have a folder called components where all of these components would exist, and then a folder called hooks where the hooks would exist. I'm just going to keep these like this for now, but just remember that. So inside of here, I'll create a new folder called hooks, and I'm going to create a new file called initDate, or let's just call it useDate.jsx. So we have the useDate.jsx. Actually, we don't need JSX because we're not going to return any JSX. Let's just use it as normal JavaScript. Let's start by just simply importing React and useEffect, which we need to destructure from React. And let's paste this entire use effect inside of this file. Actually, we need to export a function. So let's export const, and we'll call this use date, just like the file name. And inside of here, this is where we want to paste our effect. So we have this huge effect here, but this effect has a couple of dependencies, right? This effect requires events and nav, but that's not in this file. So we need to pass those in as arguments to this function here. So events and nav. What this is doing is it's actually setting days. So what I kind of want to do is just also pass in the ability to set days. So we'll say that this function, this useDate custom hook, also accepts set days as an argument here. So what I'm going to do is jump into my app component and delete all of that, which I already did because I cut it. And I'm going to import it here at the top. I'm going to import my useDate hook. So import useDate from hooks/useDate. So now I can use the hook. What I want to do is implement it right here. So let's just say use date, just like this, and pass in the 3 arguments it requires, which is events, nav, and set days. So I'll just copy that over, paste it in, events exists as state right here, so that's getting passed in. Nav exists as state right here, which is getting passed in. And set days is actually the function that updates our days state right here. So I'm actually giving that hook this state right here. I'm gonna click save and let's just see if this works. Okay, it does not like that. It says set date display is not defined. So inside of our hook here, we were calling set date display. We're calling it right here. And that again is state inside of the app component. So we could go through and say set date display, pass that in here, and then take that as an argument here, save. And then when I go back, then you can see it's again going to require event for date being this function right here that we're using inside of this app component. So as you can see, I'm going to keep having to paste in arguments every time this functionality requires a new value. Now you can see it works fine, but I don't want to sit here and go through and paste in 5 arguments. And then if I were to add another piece of functionality inside of here that this needs 6 arguments and 7 arguments, etc., I don't like the way that this looks. So instead, what I'm going to do is have this component manage its own state, or this hook manage its own state that it will then return to here. So what do I mean by that? I think it makes sense to pass in events and nav because that's state that this component manages and should always manage. So let's go back into our use date hook and remove everything except for events and nav. And let's import use state here. Now let's have this hook manage its own state for the date display. So let's say date display and set date display. And then let's also make sure that we get the other information that it needs as well. There was the event for date function. Now, as for the event for date function, I'm just going to copy this over to my use date hook. So now I have access to that function. And then we need set days. So let's also do the same thing here. We'll have it manage its own days state. So days, set days is equal to use state, initialized as an empty array, save. Okay, now it doesn't break, but what we need to do is make sure that we're setting and returning some things. So below the use effect, let's return an object with both the date display and the days. So days and the date display. Now this use date hook is managing its own state. It has the functionality for the use effect all baked into here. And then it's returning an object with the days and the date display. So now, since I don't have to manage that state in this component anymore, I can actually get rid of my state for that here and instead set those values equal to use date. So I can say days and date display. So now I'm destructuring out days and date display from the use date hook. And when I save, you can see we get the full functionality of the app. And this looks much, much, much cleaner. So we basically removed about 60 lines of code from our app component and put it inside of its own custom hook, which is super helpful for us to keep our code clean. Okay, so that was pretty interesting. We took a vanilla JavaScript application that we made in a previous tutorial and converted it over completely to React. If you found this tutorial helpful and you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any future videos. And I will see you all in the next video.